Welcome to the Future Proof Leader podcast. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Jessica Rapach, and I am co-founder of Twin Legacy Solutions. And today I'm honored to have John Lentini. He is the president of Bold Training Corps and partner of Crestcom International. So, John, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. I always like to kick it off by just having you tell the audience members a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, that's a big question. Who am I and what do I do? I work in leadership development training. I've been doing that full time for, I guess, close to 8 years with Crestcom International, as you'd mentioned. I have a background in corporate, working for some of the world's largest investment banks for over 2 decades around the globe. The people agenda became most interesting to me after a few decades of corporate service. So I went my own way and built my own business, partnering with Crestcom, who is a global leadership development organization. It's been around for close to 40 years. So that's been my segue into the formal leadership training, facilitation, and coaching space, which has been a very exciting journey for me. Really kind of met my passions where they were. And in addition to that, I've developed my own intellectual property more recently. I delivered a popular TEDx talk last year, and I do keynotes around that framework, which is really about how we develop character in leadership, because my personal view and my mission is that character is a dwindling resource and a dwindling presence in society, in leadership, both public and private leadership. So I've devised a system to both develop and diagnose character in leadership.
I love that. That's amazing. I can't wait to learn more. I have a lot of questions for you today. And of course, the podcast is all about leadership and AI. So we'll have some integration there. I know you talk AI a little bit about AI and how it kind of relates to everything that you discuss when it comes to character and how it's integrating in the world. So I guess we could kick off with an AI question. So most leaders are focusing on how to use AI, but from your perspective, what does it actually mean to be a steward of AI and not just a user of AI?
Yes, so we talk a lot in leadership development about the distinction between leadership versus management, right? I do a lot of that up front with my clients. We often conflate those two terms and mix them up, and they're really two very different things. So that's been the standard discussion in leadership development for years. As part of my model, this character model, which is a 6-style system of discipline, mindset, resilience to lead yourself, integrity, empathy, and then influence to lead others, I have a bonus style of creativity. It's outside of my core character developing framework. And that's because I don't think you need to be creative to be a leader yourself, but you need to be able to steward creativity, to your point. So I think the discussion going forward that I would like to drive is the distinction between leadership and stewardship, because increasingly we'll be potentially managing less people, right? As AI displaces certain roles, not all functions, it's not going to destroy the world. I'm an optimist. But as it does displace, we will have many quote unquote leaders who are leading technology more than leading people, perhaps. And then it does come down to, where is the character in that leadership as developed by the framework that I have? Because it's going to take character-driven leadership to responsibly steward what AI's capabilities are into the future, so it's used in the right ways. Because it obviously could go very wrong if it's not stewarded properly. So my idea of stewardship is character-driven leadership to take hold of the creativity and the opportunity that AI presents.
Now, in working with the clients that you have now, do you see that this is something that they're already kind of incorporating? Or is AI, is it feared? Is it accepted? Is it being introduced? Or how are they managing that with their leadership?
Very mixed bag. Comes up quite a bit. Interestingly, one thing that comes up a lot is people always look at me with some sort of pity, saying, aren't you concerned that AI is going to take your job? I don't take concern over that. I have to be honest with you. I feel of all professions, maybe it's the optimist in me. I'm a very human-based business. We're about interpersonal communications and how we can bring things back to relationships. When would that be more valuable than in the age of AI, when people are longing for interaction? So AI can do a lot of things that coaches and trainers do, and it will. And I encourage my clients to use it. Some of them are more reluctant than others. Some of them adopt it immediately, but it can enhance a lot of the coaching practices we have. I encourage clients to use different AI interfaces to stress test communications. If they have a touchy client situation, use AI as a coach. Run the old advice would always be, if you're going to send an email, have a second set of eyes look at it, right? Turn to your colleague and say, did I say anything I shouldn't have said here? AI is so much more powerful in that respect. Prompt them with the details of the hot topic you're dealing with, the touchy client situation, explain what you're trying to navigate. This is what I plan to write. What are my blind spots? AI can be tremendous. I use it personally in that way, and I encourage my clients to. And I'm not passing my responsibilities to AI. It enhances what I do. So I don't see it as a threat. I see AI as something that can extend what we do. It will threaten certain things. It may impact some of my business opportunities, but I think will also extend others. So, you have a choice between optimism and pessimism. Why would you not choose to be an optimist, right?
If you go on my LinkedIn profile, I identify myself as an aggressive optimist.
There we go.
Because I think that it's all about perspective, right? So you talk about, I hear this all the time, right? So on the podcast, I talk leadership and AI all the time. And this topic comes up a lot, and I can like sense the fear in some people of like, yeah, the uncertainty of like, what is the world going to look like or whatever. So the way I look at it is, I watch my children play a lot of these electronic games. You get the Wii, you can play tennis with the TV, you can talk and have a conversation, like communicate with the AI, but playing Wii tennis on TV with a computer is completely different. It moves different muscles. It's a different environment. It's a different feel. It's a different connection when you're doing it with a person. And like you said, when you view AI as a enhancement in your life to enhance your capability, I feel like that would make leadership and coaches better in a sense for communication, but you really can't replace character, like you're talking about, compassion, empathy. If I'm having a conversation with even an AI bot, I had somebody on my podcast that are making little leadership AI bots, and they're avatars and they're trying to like have compassion and stuff, but there's nothing like grabbing a cup of coffee with your coach, or sitting down face to face with someone and just looking at their expression and seeing and feeling that they can actually understand what you're saying and they can empathize with you, and then their advice becomes much more real than a scripted response. And AI is awesome, right? So I have a business, we do AI, we incorporate in businesses, help them optimize their workflows. But I feel like people do drive businesses. And if you want to enhance people, you need other people to do that. You need motivational people to get in front of them. I mean, even if it's virtual, you're still talking to a human. I think there's something to be said in human interaction and connection. And because us humans have been spending so much time on these menial tasks that AI can now replace, we have even more opportunity to collaborate. So imagine if you're really high aggressive staff that has always been on top of the emails, always been on top of, getting the reports in. Now channel that energy to operations, creativity, team meeting, collaboration, what your company could then look like. So I have this conversation a lot, and I think a lot of people connect with that. So to your point, I love that you're optimistically saying that it's not going to replace the world, because I also agree with you. I feel like there's just not, you can't replace people. And if you do, it's going to be really hard to get them back into your workspace. So I love that response. Sorry, that was long-winded, but it's definitely a topic that we are pretty passionate about here too. So there's a rush right now to adopt AI tools across organizations. Like we've all seen it, right? We want to keep up with our competitors. We want to be, cutting edge. Bleeding edge is what some people are saying now. But what risks do leaders create when they're focusing on AI, what it can do before defining like what it should do within their business?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the point of stewardship, right? Are we doing things responsibly? Are we just trying to be the first to market before we understand what we're doing? Are we displacing human jobs before we understand the downside and what's distinctly human and necessary? So we are seeing that, and we will see that. We will see some reckless, accelerated, perhaps poor decisions that are made. That's why the framework of developing character is critical, because I don't have a decision-making dial in my 6 dial framework, because effective decision-making is organic across those other 6 dials. If you develop character and leadership, if you know what your values are, if you have integrity, making the right decisions becomes semi-automatic, right? Becomes quite easy. So it's really no different than what we see today, though. We've had that all along. We've had good decision-making and bad decision-making. People who try to leapfrog competitors, try to get ahead of competitors, first to market. Being a first mover is not always an advantage. Seeing what the mistakes your competitors have made. We've seen this with all of the technology that's changed the world, right? If you look at Friendster and MySpace,
Oh, yeah.
Facebook learned from that, right? They're a thing of the past, and look where we are today. There's countless examples like that. Being a first mover is sometimes, you're the one doing the experiments that others can learn from, and you pay the price for it. You invest in it. Now, that's not always the case. There's being a first mover, but it's not the pure, unadulterated advantage that many perceive it to be. I talk a lot about Japanese concepts throughout my upcoming book, because I had a lot of experience working for Japanese organizations and in Asia. And if you're familiar at all with Japanese concepts as they apply to leadership and culture in general, there's a concept called wabi-sabi. And this is about beauty in the imperfection. when pottery is formed by hand, it's the imperfections that make it have character, right? A different form of character. But that's what makes it valuable. My view is that is what's going to be, really increasingly in demand as we move forward. The appetite and the premium paid for things that are distinctly human is going to increase. Handmade items, as opposed to mass-produced, AI-generated, 3D printed, whatever it may be, the imperfections that maybe don't get as much credit as they should have in previous generations, I think that's going to be something that is coveted. And from a service standpoint, that's what leadership development is. That's what coaching is. There's going to be a premium and a strong appetite for that human touch point. People will long for it. They'll need it. It's tied to longevity. It's tied to mental health. So no, I'm not overly concerned about being displaced by AI. I do think it can and will be adopted irresponsibly and too quickly by some, but that's part of the evolution. We'll have to, deal with those bumps in the road, right?
Right. No, absolutely. And you mentioned earlier, so there might be fewer people in some areas with more you're having to figure out your leadership style to manage people and intelligent systems. So what advice, what fundamental leadership skills do you think are going to be the most prevalent when we're dealing in those spaces?
Well, a loaded answer is certainly my framework. That's predominantly why my framework, I devised it. So you've got 3 dials to lead yourself. This is responsible self-leadership to determine your own outcomes. Discipline, mindset, and resilience. This is what any leader can do. And we're all leaders, whether we're managing others or leading other people in terms of roles and responsibilities, or we're just leading ourselves to determine our own outcomes. Those are the 3 things we should want everybody in organizations to navigate: their discipline, their mindset, and their resilience. Once you're tasked with leading other people, and you do have the formal responsibility of managing, supervising, or actually leading other people, that requires a separate set of dials, a separate level of accountability. And that's where integrity becomes more at the forefront. Integrity always matters, but if you're leading others, it becomes that much more critical. So that's the foundation to the second set in the way that discipline is to the first set. And then empathy and influence, which are really the 2 communication dials. Empathy is your receiving dial, how you understand the people on the other side of the table, how you can, you can't get what you want from them if you don't know what they want from you, right? So
right.
It's often misunderstood as a weakness, as coddling people's emotions, but empathy is really your superpower. It's how you influence people, which is the next style. That's the sending side of communication. And I define influence, and as a military veteran yourself, you'll appreciate this. I'm very careful about how I define influence, because there's people that are extraordinarily influential, but it could be through being a barrier basher and through coercion, through manipulation, and that can be influential, and it is influential. It can achieve Machiavellian ends, right, in short-term gains. But if you want long-term sustainable wins, which is what we need to consider in the age of AI particularly, my definition of influence comes from Dwight Eisenhower. Influence is getting people to do what you want them to do because he or she, of course, wants to do it themselves. So there's a heavy component of influence in that definition of leadership, right? So, it's not getting people to do what you want them to do because you told them to, because you paid them to, because it's their job, they'll be fired if they don't. But it's bringing them along and getting them to buy into your vision so that they want to drive it themselves with their own discipline, mindset, and resilience, their own passion to achieve a shared goal and a shared vision. So those 6 dials, which are the core framework, the first 3 develop determination, discipline, mindset, and resilience. That is how we develop determined leaders. The second 3 sets of integrity, empathy, and influence develop trust. Now, the sum of determination and trust, in my estimate, is character and leadership. And that is a long answer to your short question. I think that those are exactly those 6, pillars, if you will, but I see them as dials because I think they need to be calibrated and envisioned as a virtual control panel. Those 6 characteristics, I think, are the core mandate of leaders, especially as we go into the age of AI.
I hear what you're saying. The framework sounds absolutely on point. So when you go into an organization, well, how do you do this? Are you working from the C-suite down? Are you incorporating this into the leaders throughout the organization? Or what does this look like? If someone wants to come work with you today, where do you even start?
Well, my program is designed primarily for anyone who leads, manages, or supervises other people at any level, across industries, across organizations. So I'm working with C-level executives right down to entry-level managers, even some project managers or client relationship managers who may not have direct reports. So good leadership is what good leadership is. And everybody learns from everybody equally. Senior people learn from junior people as much as juniors learn from seniors. So they all commingle in the curriculum-based classroom environment. From a coaching standpoint, it becomes more bespoke. And then it's about what are the challenges you're facing in your role at your organization? How do we apply this curriculum? And this framework obviously enhances that, and it's all situational. I'm a big believer in situational and adaptive leadership. You need to meet your audience where they are. Everyone comes to a coaching discussion with a different challenge. Through an open-ended discussion, we uncover those challenges, and of course, the framework can help navigate how they can overcome those challenges.
Yeah, and a lot of coaches that I've been talking to lately have been pretty strong feelings about that leadership has to come from the top down. Is that your same perspective? When you're initially kicking off that identifying the vision, the mission from the top needs to be defined and clear before you move through the organization? Or do you feel that it's kind of anyone's game? You come in and then all leaders should understand.
Yeah, I would enthusiastically disagree with that viewpoint.
Okay. Yeah.
When the first three dials of leading yourself are about you. So in terms of determining your own outcomes as an individual, whether that be leading others or leading yourself, that is about you. When it comes to leading others, when you are tasked with leading others and you're navigating that second set of dials, it's about them. When you're a leader of others, it's no longer about you. And that is one of the biggest problems. That is one of the reasons I think character is missing from leadership. Because leaders in organizations, or I would say managers less than leaders, people in leadership positions are often mistaken for leaders. They're managers. They may not be leading effectively because too often, and I've experienced this myself throughout my corporate career countless times, far too often they see it as a reward. And they end up, kissing up and kicking down, right? When you're in that leadership position, you need to see that as a privilege. The mantra that I use, that I introduced my TEDx talk with, is that you need to learn to lead yourself before you can deliver on the privilege of leading others. I chose those words very carefully, and that it really unpacks a lot of what I feel. You must lead yourself. We talk about role modeling, leading by example. So you need to effectively lead yourself through discipline, mindset, and resilience. But once you are tasked with leading others, you have to deliver on the privilege of leading others, and you have to understand it as a privilege. You have the privilege of having others in your charge, and you need to develop them. And if you lead them well, they'll realize they did it themselves, which is what coaching is all about, right? They're not going to say, I did this because I have a great leader. They're going to say, look at how great I am, because you're bringing out the best in them and you're making them understand their capabilities and what they can deliver and how they can determine their own outcomes, which, if you've led well, will be aligned with your own desired outcomes.
I had an entire podcast with somebody where it was the definition between leadership and management and how it's very, very different. So I guess just would love your perspective. For me personally, leading someone would be empowering them to go and complete a mission, giving them a task, and then letting them figure it out. Being a leader, I've instilled enough training in you where you are empowered, you're feeling like you can handle it, you can go forth and kind of complete the mission with minimal instruction. And as a leader, like you said, I'm trying to work myself out of a job essentially, to make my people feel as though they can run the ship. They can steer the ship. You need me, I'm here. I'm going to be on that ship with you, and wherever you go, that's what it's got. Managers more like, hey, I want you to do X, Y, and Z. This is your task of the day. I need you to report back to me. And there's definitely a different kind of relationship, right? So you're kind of a tasker, right? So in your eyes, how do you define that when you're working with companies? Is it similar or different?
Yeah, absolutely. I define it exactly in those terms. There is a time and a place for both. It's important to understand management is not a bad thing. Management should not be, made extinct.
Right.
You'll be managing more than you're effectively leading in many cases because it's expedient. You don't have the time to coach, a 15-minute management meeting might be a 30 or 45-minute coaching meeting because you have to ask open-ended questions and bring out their thoughts and get inside their head. We don't always have the time for that. I understand that. But you do need to pick your spots that you do effectively coach and lead in that way. Management, sometimes you do have to say this just needs to get done. If they're bought into the big picture, they should buy into that more directive approach to quote unquote management. The problem that I see is you get folks who are pure managers, that they don't engage, they don't speak publicly, they stay behind closed doors, they protect themselves politically, and they protect themselves by navigating the relationships above them because that's where their power center is, and they don't stick their necks out for the people who are in their charge. So that's not leadership, right? Leadership is leading the people in your charge, not managing up, but leading the people in your care. I do distinguish quite a bit. This is very much generationally driven. It's more important than ever. The boomers and Gen X, my generation, were far more willing to follow management. We were far more willing to leave some of our personal value set at the door a little less authenticity, the buzzword of the day, right?
Yeah.
We were comfortable that we had a certain set of values at home, potentially, and a certain set of values, corporate culture that we were married to for most of our life, really, because our work day was much longer than our home life in most
Right.
cases.
Yeah.
So that was something that we accepted as a norm because boomers, live to work. Gen Xers work to live. It is changed with millennials and more pronounced with Gen Z. It's going to get more exacerbated with Alpha Gen, Beta Gen as we go forward, right? And we need to be very aware of this. The attrition and the revolving door of the youngest generation is not an accident. There's a whole host of structural and economic reasons, the gig economy, the financial debt they've taken on the salary inflation has not caught up with that overhead cost of housing. They're all living at home. There's a whole host of factors. But when you think about the younger generation, they really want their quote unquote leaders to be positioned more as coaches and mentors than managers and supervisors.
Yeah.
And if the older generation doesn't adapt and pivot their nature of their relationship in that way, that attrition is going to continue to be a revolving door. It's going to continue to be a pain point. And there's no silver bullet to solve for it, but they need to look at the whole suite of strategies as to how you further engage and get buy-in from this younger generation. So it's more important now than ever to distinguish between leadership and management is the moral of the story.
Right now in companies, corporations, you like all the baby boomers, they're about to retire, right? They're about to move out in the next 10-ish years if they're not already. And that's a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of knowledge of people. It's different. Like, are we training? Are we leading? Are we making sure that wealth of knowledge is being transferred to the newer generations that are taking their positions? I've never been a part of any kind of organization that did change management really well. I don't know if it's just me and I just had like an off experience with everywhere I worked, but I feel like there's such a discrepancy on how you effectively do change management. And I think that's going to be very important. So in your leadership, in your baselines, do you help leaders with that? Because I feel like that's going to be really important.
Yeah, it's a passion for me. I worked in a formal change role in one of my roles while I was in banking.
Amazing.
I was always a champion of change, even when I was in line functions, but I was a change manager. And I do run a change program within my leadership training program, which is
Amazing.
one that I'm quite passionate about. This is what I always say when it comes to change. When you deliver change, it typically gets over the line at some point. And you usually have a celebration. You send out a memorandum celebrating the success. You may have a party to recognize it, depending on the change. Some changes are just small things that happen daily. But if there's a big project or a big, undertaking, we typically pat ourselves on the back at the end of it, right? But for change to have been delivered successfully, three things need to have happened, in my view. It needs to have been delivered on time, on budget, and with the intended result. In my experience, and from what I see with clients, it's very rare that all three of those things are true. But we still say, yeah. So how do we avert that? Well, we have a 5-step framework in order to avert that, and all 5 steps matter. And I encourage my clients to keep that one pager of the 5 steps and the definitions in front of them as they're driving through significant change, and keep their eye on the ball as to where their gaps. Because you really need, I ask people on a regular basis throughout this program to answer 5 questions and keep your hand up if you can say yes to all of these. Exceedingly rare that anybody in an audience of, let's say, 30 participants in a program can keep their hand up for all 5 questions. It's usually 2 or 3. And again, if you don't have your hand up for all 5, that means your change was not fully successful, which means you likely didn't deliver it on time, on budget, and with the intended result. So those 5 things are a purpose. Start with why, as Simon Sinek would say, right? We call this the burning platform. Absolutely. What's wrong with the status quo? And not just understanding it, but you communicate it so that the whole audience that's being dragged through this change understands why we need to leave from where we are. And if you're a strategic visionary who's doing something ahead of the curve, it's going to take more work because you might see why you need to do it now, but not everyone else doesn't. And just because it's so clear to you, communication is key. And we talk about a 7x7 communication strategy. You need to communicate at least 7 times, 7 different ways for it to reach your audience. Verbally, memorandum, town halls, breakout, lunch and learns, the whole 9 yards, right? So the purpose is the first step. Then the destination. So this is what's wrong with the status quo, why we need to leave, but where are we going? What's the light at the end of the tunnel? What's my vision? And again, the communication strategy is critical. Does everybody understand where you're going? Are you using visuals and mock-ups if they're available to show where we're going, right?
Yeah.
Then we need to define the plan, and especially for the analyticals. If you don't give them a clear documented plan with toll gate reviews and milestones and stakeholders and Gantt charts and deliverables, are going to go into meltdown. So a clearly documented and again well communicated and well shared plan is key. Right. Partnerships. Who are the people? Who are the external vendors, perhaps? Who are the internal champions that are going to be inside of all the impacted silos? who can manage all the dissent that's going to be happening in the shadows that you're not there to address. So identifying very carefully, strategically, and politically the partners, and of course, potentially the paid vendors or hired, outside business partnerships. And then the final one is the rewards. What's the WIFM? What is in it for me, for my emotional investment, my time investment? Why should I care about this? So those are very 5 key things. And again, all 5 of them matter. If you just miss one of those 5 things, your change will not be delivered on time, on budget, and with the intended result. So it's simple, but almost always missed. And I often engage with people in the middle of massive change. And it's always like, oh, if only I had this 6 months ago, right?
Yeah.
But that is the key.
I was never the change management champion. It wasn't ever me, but I feel like it fell on me a lot of times because it was so poorly managed. But I feel like there was such a divide, right? So you have like the C-suite and the maybe like the first 3 tiers of leaders in an organization, very aware of the change. Like let's say a reorg that was like one of the pains of my existence as an IT project manager. Reorging and then having to reorganize an entire IT system as an aftermath, right? Which nobody ever thought of, or it wasn't well planned, or they didn't think it would be that much work to just direct all of our code and stuff like that. So I feel like at the upper levels, it might be very clear strategically the why. We're reorging because these personnel needs more support over here, or we think that the function of this department isn't really clearly defined, and I don't know if it's necessary. So we're going to divide them into other departments. Well, now you're breaking apart a team, right? So then you get to a certain organizational level. Let's see, mid-level managers. You don't get that kind of communication on the why strategic outlook, right? But you are the sergeants of the Marine Corps, right? So I said the sergeants of the Marine Corps, they're backbone. They do all the work. They are the ones that are impacted the most because then they're leading all the people on the ground doing the work, right? So I was an officer, the sergeants, they got things done. Well, I feel like middle managers are often the sergeants, but they don't always know the clear mission. And it's frustrating because then you're turning to your people. What do you say to them? How do you lead them? You have to either make it up, make it exciting, and try to come up with something. But I feel like there's always a disconnect in organizations. They don't do that well. And that is how change starts usually from what I've experienced. And then they bring in all the support and everything. Everybody's on board. The change is happening. The change happened. Then everybody's gone. There's no training. There's no ongoing. What's your sustainability plan? What's the outlook for the next year? Well, what happens if this change at the 3-month mark, the 6-month? Where's the check-in? There's no follow through. From my experience, there might be organizations that do this really, really well, but I feel like change management has always been on the back burner of any organization I've ever worked for. Yes,
you're absolutely right that organizations do not at all spend enough time formally training people on change. As I mentioned, I was a change manager. I was a senior director at an organization in a change role. I wasn't trained on change. I was given the role because I had functional expertise in the line areas that I was being tasked with changing. There's value there, but there was never any kind of training or curriculum around this. Is the things I do now, if only I'd had them then, right? Even though I was a senior change leader. So that's the first thing. Change training is critical, especially when you're tasking people formally change. It just doesn't happen. The other thing is it's a psychological process, to your point. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Kubler-Ross grief model. It's a model that was designed by, I believe, some Swiss psychologists. It's about loss. It was originally introduced about losing a loved one, but it really applies to anyone who's trying to come to grips with change. It was a very pronounced model that we talked a lot about during COVID. When people have trouble coming to grips with their new reality, you go through this process of denial and resentment, and then you go into this nadir where you fall into the abyss and you're depressed, and there's just a complete lack of acceptance. You slowly climb out of that bottom of the curve, and you come to a place of acceptance, but it takes time. But when you drive change through an organization, what we typically see is this goes through usually around 3 iterations. So let's call it a C-level group behind closed doors in a boardroom as the architects of change. There usually will not be pure consensus across that group of people. There may be 2 or 3 naysayers who don't buy in. They're professionals. We hope they know how to work well together. So ultimately, they'll come to some consensus, and there'll be a unified strategy that's going to be presented. Even if everyone didn't fully believe in it, they've all found a way to agree on consensus. Everyone leaves that boardroom with a unified strategy after going through this process, however long it took, and going through their own grief curve of denial all the way to acceptance. Then they have to go communicate this change, which took them time, to go through this Kubler-Ross grief cycle to mid-level management. Okay, this is something that we're going to do. And you just communicated for the first time. You may have been discussing this for 3 months, but it's been under lock and key. Yep. Now they all start this grief cycle all over again. You can imagine the emotional, psychological drag this places on any organization, right? So mid-level management has to come to grips with it. This is where you inevitably get people saying these terrible decisions that leadership makes. I don't understand why they're doing this. Yep. they all go through that process. A good change manager is going to navigate that process because it's a psychological process. You have to have tools and concepts and how to navigate the resistance. But ultimately, that mid-level tier will have to, in some form, in some capacity, at least some coalitions, will come to a place of acceptance, but then they have to communicate it to the lower level staff. And guess what? The whole cycle starts for a third time. Yes. So there's a lot of emotional and time delays that are driven by all of this. What I would say is you have to drive a very thoughtful, nuanced approach, and this is where empathy becomes key. I come from a finance as well as an operations background. I worked, very much in both of those areas, running large finance and operations functions separately. So I think in terms often of the push and pull of finance versus operations. There's many large change agendas at organizations that are driven to improve finance, to improve the way the general ledger posts, to improve the way the financial statements are produced, which is critically important to everybody in the organization. Operations often is tasked with doing most of the heavy lifting in terms of the extra UAT testing, the extra hours, the above and beyond, but they don't see the direct benefits. So when you're driving change, it's not about a broad stroke saying this is the WIFM, this is the reward, this is what's in it for you. You have to understand there may be more rewards for some and less for others. Maybe the areas that are having less rewards are doing more of the work. You need to sell it accordingly. You need to let them understand the benefits for them. If you're fixing things downstream for finance, you're going to have less inquiries, less escalations to you. You're going to have less aging items you have to deal with. So you have to, whatever the case may be, you have to understand the through line and communicate the WIFM based on the area, about the effort they have to put in versus the reward that they see. And the reward may not be that obvious, and that's where leadership becomes important. You have to identify what the WIFM is, what's in it for them across all areas, effectively communicate it, and get buy-in from those champions.
100%. And in IT, it's never like, it's like, oh, and when can you do that? When can you get it done? Like what's the timeline? How long is it going to take? Yeah. You could find something like what's in it for me, less IT issues and less routing or whatever, but that's just one area, but I can't imagine that's exactly how it goes. You always get people that no matter how effectively you try to implement something, they don't like change. That's fine. And you always get those in a crew, but you'll get reasonable people that are like, if you can just explain it to me, why, like, I'm happy to do it, but what is the point? If there's a point in an objective and there's actual like positive outcome, I'm willing to change. I'm willing to adapt. But you need to sell me on that. And they need to feel like they're important enough to get that message too, which they should be, right? They're the boots on the deck. They are important. They're the ones driving the machine. So I couldn't agree more. You have a book coming out. So can you tell us quickly, how can we get your book, or where is it going to be sold, and where can we find you?
It'll be available everywhere. It's got distribution through Simon & Schuster, but I must say we're speaking today in May of 2026. I have deferred my release date to July of 2027 for strategic reasons. Gotcha. But it will be available for pre-sale probably by the end of the summer. So I will be encouraging people to get on Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, wherever they buy their books. It will be called Engineering Character: 6 Styles to Build Better Leaders. One thought I would like to share, though, given what you'd said, because it's something that resonated with me recently with change. It being a psychological process. Since it is a psychological process, many managers may say, I can't be a therapist. I can't be everybody's therapist. They have problems. And I think that's, a fair concern. But I heard a distinction recently, because it is a coaching process. And the distinction between therapy and coaching really resonated with me, in that therapy is a regression process. Coaching is a progression process. So when you're driving people through change, it is psychological, but you want to coach them because you want to coach them how they move forward, not figure out what went wrong or why they're upset about what happened yesterday or last week, right? So coaching is about progress. It is about moving forward. And I think that distinction really resonated with me. So hopefully it'll resonate with some listening. There's value in both. There's a time and a place for both, but that is from an organizational standpoint, you want to think forward. So coaching is how you navigate the psychological impact. You don't have to see yourself as a therapist, but as an effective coach, right?
I think coaching is such an awesome trend right now. There's so much value in it. And I feel like it wasn't valued, in the years past. And I feel like now more than ever, with all the change, the AI, speaking of change, I feel like we're in an AI generational era of change where people are being overwhelmed. They have this fear, anxiety about AI, like if you don't know how to adapt it, if you don't know how to do it, are you going to get a job? Are you going to lose your job? All those things. So I think it's important more than ever to grasp to somebody outreach because there is a lot going on right now. So
There definitely is, and it can be overwhelming, but we
it
just
is
need to wrap
overwhelming.
our arms around it. But back to the point, my book will be coming out, but if anyone's interested in the topic, my TEDx talk would be a good introduction. That's out there on YouTube, 3 Dials to Lead You, a control panel for life and leadership, John Lentini. So that'll introduce the first 3 dials of discipline, mindset, and resilience. So if that piques anyone's interest, then there'll be a book to follow. It'll build out the entire 6 dial
And
plus
then
one.
John's going to write a book on change management for everybody who needs it. And we'll have you back on the podcast to talk about that too.
There's some components of change that will come out of the book. I profile, there's a lot of historical narratives in there. I profile people who are sort of historic change managers that I call out, but there's a lot. I try to write the book so that it plays out like literature. I'm not sure if I achieved that,
Ah,
but that was my goal. It's part memoir, part self-help, part leadership, but also largely historical narratives that support my arguments. So I hope people will enjoy it.
that is really cool. Okay. Well, thanks for being on the show, John. It was such a pleasure to learn all of your techniques and you put a lot of thought into how you coach and how you lead other people. So I appreciate you coming on and just sharing a little bit about that. I hope people visit your website, find you on LinkedIn, get on that book. I'm sure it's going to be quick selling. So get on the book pre-sale list would be cool. And to our listeners, thanks again for joining the Future Proof Leader podcast, and we will see you next time. Bye, John.
Thank you, Jessica.